to medieval India. First part. Arabs and Hindus in the 10th century. After the science of Quranic commentary, of tradition of jurisprudence, and the mystic path of the Sufi sheikhs, I have not observed such advantages from any branch of learning than history. History is the knowledge of the annals and the traditions of the prophets, of caliphs, of sultans, and of the great men of religion and of government. Low fellows, rascals, unfit and unworthy persons, inferior people, and those with base aspirations, people of unknown stock and mean nature, of no lineage and low lineage, loiterers and bazaar loafers, all such people have no place in history. It is not their trade and skill. A knowledge of history does not advantage such people, and profits them in no circumstance. Rather it is harmful to base and mean fellows to read and know history. What higher honor for history is possible than that mean and low people have no inclination or desire for this rare form of knowledge that is of no profit for them in their lowly dealings and their filthy morals, and that history is the only science of learning in any quarter from which they desire no benefit whatsoever. Thus Ziauddin Barani, the moralist and chronicle writer of the 14th century. This course is a history of events in what used to be called the Muslim period of Indian history. The term itself goes back to the seminal work of James Mill, History of British India, from 1811, who first divided the history of India in the Hindu, the Muslim and the British period. The first period commences with the coming of the Aryans in the 13th century before Christ. The second period commences with the invasion of Mahmud of Ghazni in the 10th century, Anno Domini, and the third with the Battle of Plassey in 1757. It has, in parentheses, become fashionable lately to refer to Common Era when referring to what used to be called before and after the birth of Christ. But I have never understood what the supposed gain of this Common Era is. After all, to somebody from Iran, the Hijri dating, as used there, is the Common Era, and the Common Era is still another word for Christian Era. I will also not give in to the common use of historians of Islam to give the dates in that lunar calendar that is used in many Islamic countries. This division by British, Muslim and Hindu era is clearly untenable nowadays. Not only since the British are patently not there anymore, and we would then have to distinguish an awkward post-British or post-colonial period, but also to refer to the entire middle period as the Muslim era obscures that for most of that time, most of the Indian subcontinent, indeed almost all of it for much of the period, was not under Muslim rule, and Kerala in the extreme south was never under Muslim rule at all, besides the very small Muslim principality of Aziraja, which covered little more than the bazaar of the city of Kannur. Whereas finally, during the so-called Hindu period, many Indian kingdoms were Buddhist, and those included the great Maurya Empire of the 3rd century before Christ. Historians have now generally substituted from the old tripartite division a new one. Ancient history, where the coming of the Aryans marks the divide with Indian prehistory, for as long as the writing of the Indus civilization has not been deciphered, medieval and modern history. For most historians, the divide between the latter two is in 1757, although that, in my view, is a grotesque overestimate of the importance of the Battle of Plassey. For reasons I will go in later, I think the divide should rather be placed in 1739. As to the beginnings of the medieval period, many Indian historians have moved the date backward from 1000 to then the divide between ancient and medieval should be placed at some point round the invasion of the Huns. That is roughly in the beginning of the 6th century. This medieval period is then further divided in an early medieval period running from the 6th to the 10th century, a high medieval period up to the 16th century, often also called the time of the Delhi Sultanate, and the late medieval, or more generally, the Mughal period. However, although the period of the Hun invasion in the early 6th century indeed was a big upheaval on the subcontinent, this upheaval was neither so prolonged nor so dramatic as the fall of the Roman Empire is in European history, let alone that it is such a clear dividing line as the coming of Islam is for the history of the Middle East or for the Byzantine Empire. In India, both the traditional high culture of the courts and the temples and the entire socio-economic order remained intact and remained more or less the same from the 6th to the 10th centuries. This period may perhaps rather be called the late antique or late classical period, following modern European medieval historians, who now generally prefer that term late classic for what used to be called the early Middle Ages. The beginning of Muslim rule, by contrast, is a clear caesura, even if there were obvious continuities as well, and in the Indian South all largely remained the same until the early 13th century. Strictly speaking, the late classical period lasted until that time in the south. Still, despite all that, the Muslim incursions and invasions marked an epochal change in the cultural and economic pattern of India. It is well comparable to the changes that occurred in the Middle East with the coming of Islam. For this was really for the first time since the coming of the Aryans that Indian civilization was challenged by a ruling class with a system of beliefs that could not be assimilated into the older Hindu religious and social order, as so many previous invaders had been assimilated, such as the Kushanas in the 1st century, the Huns in the 6th, the Scythians in the 3rd century before Christ, or even Alexander's Greeks. Over time, even those Greek rulers who still considered themselves superior to their Indian surroundings had become virtually indistinguishable from other Indian sovereigns. They had adopted the Buddhist religion, and they were now making offerings to Hindu gods. And the Yavanas, as the Hindus called the Greeks, were assigned a place in the caste system. Muslims, however, refused to do any of that, nor did the Muslims over time turn into a caste like all the earlier invaders from Central Asia. Of course, over time, the Muslims adopted Indian food, Indian dress, and many Indian words. The Muslim language that evolved over time, Urdu, the official language of Pakistan nowadays, is structurally the same as the main Hindu language nowadays called Hindi, but with some 40% of all its words derived from Arab and Persian. And it is, of course, written in Arab letters. However, while that is true, throughout Indian Islam remained convinced it was the one only true religion, and Hinduism was pagan unbelief. Moreover, it experienced constant movements to reassert the orthodox belief system that was ultimately derived from Iraq or Arabia, and to cleanse it from any Indian practices that were deemed heretical by the religious orthodoxy. In my opinion, too many historians and linguists even more so overemphasize the so-called syncretism of Indian Islam, the extent to which it merged with Hindu practices. They see practices that the guardians of the faith perceived as heresy or as condemnable innovation, and that they sharply criticized as typical for Indian Islam, while they overlook the orthodox mainstream. Moreover, though the economy of Muslim India was often based on, or at least followed, Indian patterns, and that was as could be expected since peasants' production changed little, the most basic institution of the early Muslim state, the military assignment of land, or iqta, that I will often, for brevity's sake, refer to as fief was derived from practices in Iran and West Asia and did not stem from Indian ones. On the most mundane level, of course, the period around 1000 marks a transition in the training of historians and the skills demanded from them. The history of the period before 1000 is largely written by Indologists, that is, students of Indian languages and linguistics, and it has to be derived from inscriptions on stone and copper and from coins, with some scant evidence gleaned from literary sources. These sources are largely written in Sanskrit, except for the Tamil-speaking Deep South. The history of the next period is largely based on chronicles written on paper in Persian. The historians of this period have to be first in Persian, and for the later period in Marathi, English, Dutch, Portuguese, or Old Hindi. Now an observer traveling to India in the 10th century, from the great metropolis of the Islamic world, from Baghdad, from Nishapur in northeastern Persia, or Balkh in Afghanistan, could have argued that Indian civilization, which was then already of vast antiquity, having 2000 years of history behind it, and it had produced some of the greatest artistic and philosophic achievements of humanity, had definitely passed its zenith. American historian William McNeill argued that in every period of world history, since at least the 4th century before Christ, there was a global center of innovation. Their ideas in literature, ideas in art, religious thought, philosophy and science, as well as technical techniques and inventions, were assembled from many different places. At such a central locus, they are then thought through systematically with the aid of the other traditions and are newly synthesized. These thoughts are then, in that new form, diffused throughout the Eurasian landmass. To him, this focus had from roughly the 3rd to the early 8th century after Christ been India. But somewhere around the middle of the 8th century, it had passed to the empire of the Caliphs, to Baghdad, and to such places as Balkh and Nishapur. Those two were then, with more than 100,000 inhabitants, among the biggest cities of the world. They were only outclassed by the capital of China's Tang dynasty, Chang'an, and they were far larger than Constantinople, which may have had 60,000 inhabitants, let alone to such oversized villages as London or Paris, which had no more than a few thousand. Somewhere around the 11th century, this primacy then passed on from the Islamic countries to soon China. However, the relationship of early Islam to what had been the intellectual and cultural fulcrum of Eurasia was initially that of a master and an apprentice, and to a large extent the efflorescence of Islamic thought in both theology, secular science, and scholarship from the 7th century onward was caused precisely by the creative joining of the Greek and Indian ideas and traditions. Indian ideas that were not or only vaguely known to the Romans, or ideas that had been developed in the Gupta period from the 3rd to the 6th century, when the Roman Empire was in deep economic and intellectual decline. The Arabs under the early Caliphate went through a period of Indian apprenticeship in the 7th century. At that time, they held India in awe as a place that far outclassed them in its intellectual achievements. It was a true discovery of India, and it has profoundly influenced Islamic thought and, I dare say, Islamic practice ever since. The Roman Empire, after all, never extended beyond the Euphrates. But as Sindh had come under the direct rule of the Caliph, there came embassies from Indian courts to Baghdad. And with them came scholars, as we are told, who brought along 2 books, the Brahma Siddhanta, attributed to Brahma Gupta, and his Kandi Kadiyaka. Aided by these pundits, Al-Fazari, held by Yaqub ibn Tariq, translated these works from Sanskrit into Arabic. Both books saw heavy use ever since, and they have exercised a great influence on Arab science. It was from them that the Arabs became acquainted with scientific astronomy. Brahmagupta was their prime teacher here, rather than the Greek Ptolemy. But as they became familiar with both the Greek and the Indian systems, the Arab scientists not only joined the two, but they improved on both. Another influx took place under the Caliph Harun al-Rashid from 786 to 808. And that Caliph is of course the Caliph of the 1001 Nights. Some listeners may also recall the elephant that he had probably been given by an Indian embassy before Harun al-Rashid sent to the court of Charlemagne. His ministerial family of Barmak, then at the zenith of their power, had come with the ruling dynasty from Balkh, where an ancestor of theirs had been an official in a Buddhist temple called the Nauheder in Arab text. That means Nava Vida, or the new temple. The Barmak family had been converted, but their contemporaries never thought much of their profession of Islam, and they did not regard their conversion as genuine. Induced probably by their family traditions, the Barmaks sent scholars to India to study medicine and pharmacology. They hired Hindu scholars to come to Baghdad, made them to the chief physicians of hospitals, and ordered them to translate from Sanskrit into Arabic books on medicine, on pharmacology, on toxicology, on philosophy, on astrology, and on other subjects. All this deeply influenced Islamic writings on medicine. Those writings were later on translated into Latin, and they were to form the basis of Western medicine up to the 17th century. Still later, Muslim scholars traveled for the same purposes as the emissaries of the Barmak. Islamic theology and metaphysics, for example, developed the theory of the atom, which, according to one historian, had become firmly established in theological circles by the middle of the 9th century. It owes its fundamental view not to Greek atomism, but to an Indian influence that has not yet been precisely identified, but that was clearly transmitted directly to the Arabs via Buddhism, in which theory of the atom were prominent features. For Central Asia had been largely Buddhist before its conquest by the Arabs. The great Indian treatise on astronomy, the Siddhanta, known to the Arabs as the Sindh, became the foundation of Islamic astronomy and mathematics. Its author, Brahmagupta, had, for example, estimated the circumference of the Earth to be 7,000 yojanas, which is almost exactly accurate. Columbus' estimate, on the other hand, 700 years later, was 1/3 of the actual circumference of the Earth. A tidbit of information I merely mention to make clear how far the West was then behind both Islam and India. The single most brilliant scientist of this period, Muhammad ibn Musa al-Khwarizmi's work, who was known in the West as the Algorithmus, which was based on the Sindh, was written during the reign of Caliph al-Ma'mun. Al-Khwarizmi laid the foundation of modern mathematics in 2 books. In one book, known in translation in medieval Europe as the Book of Algorithmus, he introduced the Indian place system numerals, which we now call Arab figures, but they are simply the Indian figures that are still used in India. And he also introduced algorithmic mathematic calculations there. And in another book that came to be known in the West as the Algebra, he reworked and systematized the algebraic calculation methods that were used in Indian astronomical works. One of the world's earliest monuments of linguistics beyond India, where linguistics goes back to Panini, who wrote in the 3rd century before Christ, was a careful grammar of classical Arab. It was composed at about the same time by Sibawayh, a non-Arab scholar who studied in Basra and was perhaps Persian in origin. The approach to phonology in this work appears to derive from the Indian linguistic tradition, yet all such contacts were not much pursued later on, and Arab thought increasingly turned in different directions from the 9th century onwards. Under the Caliph al-Ma'mun, Greek scientific and philosophical literature began to be translated in earnest. That Greek tradition submerged the Indian tradition, but many areas of knowledge in classic Islamic culture, including astronomy, linguistics, mathematics, metaphysics, and meditational mysticism, for example, the breathing techniques that are used by the Islamic Sufi mystics and were clearly Indian in origin, and to some extent medicine, nevertheless largely remained Indian in their fundamental inspiration. So too was the educational system and the educational methods of the madrasa. And so too was its way of construction, that is derived from Buddhist monasteries. Of course, the earliest Western university, the one at Salerno, was simply a madrasa where Latin was the language of instruction. The Arabs learned the secret of paper making from captive Chinese soldiers taken to Samarkand after the Battle of Adlach, or the Battle of Talas, in 720. And with it, the production of books became easier and cheaper, and libraries multiplied. This made the spread of knowledge much easier. The smaller dynasties, which in later times tore sovereignty over certain eastern countries of the Caliphate out of the hands of the successors of Al-Ma'mun and of Harun, did however not continue the literary commerce with India. The Banu Laid dynasty, that ruled from 872 to 903, and that owned a large part of Afghanistan, were the neighbors of Hindu kings. But their name is not connected with the history of literature. During the Buyid princes, who ruled over western Persia and Iraq between 932 and 1055, the fables of Kalila and Dima were translated. The animal fables of the Panchatantra had already been translated into Middle Persian in the 6th century. They were translated again from Sanskrit directly into Arabic in the 8th century. From Arabic they then passed on into Syrian, then into Greek, and then into Latin. And the genre of the fable became hugely popular in medieval Europe, as witnessed, for example, by that eternal classic of Dutch literature, the fable van den Vos Reinaer. Of all these princely houses, no doubt, the Samanids, who held almost the whole east of the Caliphate under their sway during the period from 892, and I shall return to that dynasty in the next episode, had the most relations with the Hindus, in Kabul, in the Punjab and in Sindh. And one of their ministers, Al-Jayhani, had collected much information about India. It was then not so much that there were no contacts anymore with India, that the Muslims turned away from it, as rather the Muslims felt India did not have to teach them very much anymore. That is why they now turned to the Greek tradition. That position, that India had long passed its zenith, was certainly the one of one visitor to India at the dawn of the medieval period, in 1070. And arguably, he was the most brilliant visitor ever. He was called Abdul Hayat al-Biruni, and he came from the provincial town of Kurganj in present Uzbekistan. Al-Biruni was an historian, a linguist, a mathematician, an astronomer, a geologist, and a lot of things more. Truly, he was a one-man Academy of Science. As a friend wrote about him, his hand was almost never without a pen, his eye without an observation, and his mind never without a thought. We should imagine him with his 10 camels filled with those old books in that Sanskrit which the Afghan troopers with whom he came rated gobbledygook or heathen superstition, moving through the countryside of the Punjab. As everywhere round him, Mahmud of Ghaznī's troops were busily burning down libraries and tearing down temples. But however revolting that company was, al-Biruni had still to depend on the unreliable patronage of Mahmud of Ghazni, and so he sighed, as so many other scholars may have sighed after him, quote, "What scholar has the same favorable opportunities of studying as I have? That would only be the case with one to whom the grace of God accords, what it did not accord to me, a perfectly free disposal of his own doings and goings. But it has never fallen to me in my own doings and goings to be independent, nor to be invested with sufficient power to dispose and order as I thought best. However, I thank God for that which He has bestowed upon me, and which I must consider sufficient for the purpose." At Kurganj, al-Biruni had enjoyed the reputation of a great astrologer, and when he ventured to go to Ghazni, it was primarily to cast the horoscope of the ruler. In that way did he manage to gain access to the court, and to Mahmud himself, who liked to pose as patron of poets and scholars, as we shall see in the next episode. Most of his 180 known works were produced while he was in Mahmud's domains. But Biruni still went to Ghazni on his own free will, and the main lure for him to go there was India, which Mahmud had spent a generation conquering and pillaging. Back in Kurganj, Biruni had long admired the works of Indian astronomers and mathematicians, which he had studied in the Arab translation. Mahmud offered him a timely window on that rich scientific heritage, and Biruni eagerly opened that window. Passing through Ghazni, he pushed on to India around 1005, where he remained for 13 years. The resulting book, entitled simply India al-Hind in Arabic, is a unique intellectual tour de force that has no antecedent in the ancient or medieval work of the Middle East, let alone for contemporary Europe that had virtually no idea of the world beyond the Mediterranean, and for which India was populated with men with the heads of dogs. Biruni had long concluded that Indian learning was on the same high plateau as that of ancient Greece, and that it had no rivals elsewhere. The great purpose behind his book on India was to identify the highest achievements of Indian thought in the various sciences, and to trace their deepest source within the Indian culture. This quest led him eventually to Hinduism, which he analyzed with deep penetration and without any passion. At the time, that his patron, Mahmud, was winning plaudits throughout the Islamic world for his savage jihad against Hindu temples and shrines. As Biruni got down to work, he realized that he had to defend his decision to write a book on India and on Indians before skeptical readers of Arabic. Anticipating his critics, he accepted not only that the Hindu Indians are our enemies, as he wrote himself, but also that they differ from us in everything. Indeed, he concluded, if ever a custom of theirs resembles one of ours, it has the opposite meaning. Besides, was not the arrogance of the Hindus legendary throughout Central Asia and the Middle East? As he wrote, quote, according to their belief, there is no other country on earth but theirs, no other race of men but theirs, and no created beings beside them have any knowledge or science whatsoever. Their haughtiness is such that if you tell them of any science or scholar in Khurasan and Fars, they will think you to be both an ignoramus and a liar. If they travelled and mixed with other nations, they might soon change their minds, for their ancestors were not as narrow-minded as the present generation is. One of their scholars, Varhahi Mihira, in a passage where he calls on the people to honor the Brahmins, says, quote, the Greeks, though impure, must be honored, since they were treated in sciences and therein excelled others. What then are we to say of a Brahmin if he combines with his purity the height of science? In former times, Biruni pursued, the Hindus thus used to acknowledge that the progress of science due to the Greeks is much more important than that which is due to themselves. At first, I stood to their astronomers in the relation of a pupil to his master, as I was a stranger among them, and was not acquainted with their peculiar national and traditional method of science. On having made some progress, however, I began to show them the elements on which this science rests. I began to point out to them some rules of logical deduction and the scientific methods of all mathematics, and then they flocked together around me from all parts. They were wondering, and most were eager to learn from me. And they asked me at the same time from what Hindu master I had learned those things, while in reality I showed them what they were worth. And I then thought myself a great deal superior to them, disdaining to be put on a level with them. Yet they almost thought me to be a sorcerer. And when speaking of me to their leading men in their native tongue, they spoke of me as the sea or as the water, which is so acid that vinegar in comparison is sweet. After carefully studying Indian tradition, Biruni thus concluded that while it was no doubt a grand and a vigorous tradition, it had had its best days behind it, and it was increasingly stagnant. Much of it, in his words, was, quote, mere nonsense, a means of keeping people in the dark and throwing an air of mystery about the subject. In any case, the copiousness of Sanskrit, with all its words denoting the same thing, offers painful difficulties to those who want to learn the whole language, and it only results in a sheer waste of time. End quote. In Biruni's days, the great tradition of Sanskrit learning and of poetry had become an affair of courtiers and of their court priests, all of them located at small provincial households. They were interested in making the language and the terminology of the old text impenetrable to anybody but themselves. These priests and these court artists only wrote for a small circle of initiates who treasured virtuosity in words and were increasingly unwilling to do any investigation of their own. They always referred to the authority of the ancient texts instead. The kind of rational investigation Brahmagupta had conducted was increasingly submerged into mythology. A mythology that was at best based on interpretation and reinterpretation of ancient scriptures and was no longer based on any rational calculation or observation. Thus, later astronomers improved on the 7,000 yojanas of Brahmagupta and simply tore more worlds out of a high hat, so that the lands of the sons of Bharat, that is the inherited land of the Hindus, was given the size of 30,000 yojanas, and the entire world of gods and humans combined was determined to measure 100,000 yojanas without any empirical evidence whatsoever. Biruni commented ironically, quote, "We on our part found it already troublesome enough to enumerate all the 7 seas together with the 7 earths. And now this author thinks he can make the subject more easy and pleasant by inventing some more earth below those already enumerated by ourselves." End quote. Mathematics and astronomy were made increasingly subservient to astrology as well, which of course still plays an important role in Indian life. A modern BJP politician habitually fixes the dates of meetings and even of elections on astrologically favorable times. Mathematics and astronomy were crowded out by legend, and history became increasingly submerged into the legendary lore of the Puranas, with kings who reigned for thousands of years and so on. Similarly, the classic Sanskrit literature of the days of the great Kalidasa, or even of Bana, who wrote in the 5th and 7th century, writings that were fresh and original, were yielding to commentaries on commentaries, anthologies, conscious imitations, and varieties on older texts and intricate word games. Like science, writing had become a pursuit of a small circle of courtiers that was addressed to an equally exclusive congerie of connoisseurs, people who were consciously isolating themselves from the rest of society. Writing in Sanskrit had become like modern art. It was addressed to a small in-crowd that snubbed outsiders and that reveled in opaque references. They were isolated from the rest of the world and from the rest of society, so that not even such an event as the Muslim conquest could disturb the peace of mind of that courtly writing in Sanskrit. To quote the great Indian historian Damodar Koshambi, quote, "The last great kingdom in the north had been wiped out by Qutbuddin's defeat of Jayachandra Kahadavala. It is notable that none of these contemporary events made the slightest impression upon the mannerisms or complacencies of the local intelligentsia. The last great Sanskrit literature, written about this time and in this very region, that is Bengal, contains not the slightest mention of contemporary events. The Kahadawala court poet Sri Harsha, not to be confused with the king poet of 5 centuries earlier, wrote beautifully about the romance of the Mahabharata couple Nala and Damayanti. Doi, Lakshmana Sena's poet, imitated Kalidasa's Meghaduta, the cloud messenger, with a Pavanaduta, the wind manager. Sena court poets continued their mannered stupidities after the court had fled to East Bengal and the palace had decayed into a trifling country family. The Ramacharita, written at that court, of Sandhya Karanandi, reduced Sanskrit poetry to the level of an acrostic, for every stanza can be read in 2 different ways. It does that to represent the history of the mythical Rama, or of the last great Pala king, Ramapala. But in effect, the poem cannot be understood at all. The greatest poet of them all, Jayadeva, derived his strength from having wandered about the countryside as a minstrel, close to the common people. He has also left some ancient Hindi poetry, though he is loved, admired and revered for his Gita Govinda, the most musical, mystical and beautiful of Sanskrit poetic dramas, though it is totally unsuited for the stage. Let me add that the only branch of knowledge to which important contributions were made in the 10th and 11th century are precisely those branches that thrive on commentaries, on anthologies, and recondite wordplays and opaque allusions, namely law, which Jayaneshwar's commentaries on the Shastras, that were the legal norm in Indian courts for the next 900 years, and thriving theology with the works of the great Hindu theologian Ramanuja. India, at least critically northern India, was not just in the cultural but in the economic doldrums in the 10th century as well. Since historian R.S. Sharma wrote his pioneering study Indian Feudalism in 1965, it has been widely held by Indian historians, though not amongst their European and American colleagues, who seem to be allergic to that word feudalism, that the late ancient period was one of economic decline in the north of the Indian subcontinent. There are striking parallels in the changes which occurred in social reorganization faced by dwindling resources and decaying communications with what was occurring in Western Europe and in the Byzantine Empire in the same time. The Northern Indian recession, to be sure, was not as severe as the economic collapse in Europe after the fall of the Roman Empire, or to the somewhat milder depression in Byzantium at the same time. But it was equally prolonged. Excavations of urban sites suggest that the material culture of the Indian late antique period was of a lesser standard than before, and many sites were deserted or dwindled in population, such as the great metropolis of ancient India, Pataliputra, on the site of modern Patna. This city, that had once been on a par with Rome or Alexandria was now entirely abandoned. Floods and changes in the course of rivers have been adduced as explanation. There were certainly climatic changes in the mid-first millennium Anno Domini, when the world was passing through a cold period, a little ice age, that lasted from the 3rd to the 8th century, and that had disastrous effects on agriculture in the Near East, in Europe and in India. In India too, lands were abandoned, just as they were in the former two places. The declining trade in certain areas could well have been a cause for the urban decline too, and that particularly applied to the overland trade with the Byzantine Empire and the overland trade with China, that suffered from the decline of the famous Silk Road in the 5th and 6th centuries due to the invasion of the Huns. That had made the overland route through Xinjiang increasingly dangerous. I have, by the way, already alluded to this invasion, although it is still much debated among the specialists whether the Indian Hunna and the Iranian Hephthalites are the same group as the European Huns or a completely different one. Towns became deserted when trade routes changed and the location of markets shifted too. In particular, towns which had depended on overland trade declined as the commerce shifted from the land to the Indian Ocean, such as Taxila, another major urban center of the ancient age, that was abandoned in this period too. Urban decline could have been caused by a lesser availability of luxury products for exchange. This usually consisted of manufactured items or of agricultural products such as sugarcane, cotton and indigo. Trade also shifted to other areas, with new towns replacing older ones. The administrative centers attached to the courts of smaller kingdoms attracted some trade, however, and they became small commercial centers, but none of them were of the size of the great cities of the Gupta period, with as sophisticated a court with a similar demand for luxury products. Thus the Chinese pilgrim Zhuang Zhang in the 7th century still wrote of Tanishar, Kannauj and Benares, modern Indian term is Varanasi, as commercial cities, but by the 9th they had mainly become ceremonial centers which were conducting little trade. They had become mostly temple towns, maintained by grants of land to those temples and to their priests. The first two had earlier been administrative centers too, but Benares became an exclusively ritual center and a pilgrimage town, as it has remained over the next 1,000 years. However, some scholars have recently been arguing, without, as far as I see, much evidence, that agricultural production was increasing, particularly after the 8th century. This was supposedly due to more land being taken under the plough. Such an increased agricultural production might have required the creation of more rural markets, and with it the exchange of agrarian products could have moved out of such older urban centers as Tanishar or Benares. Moreover, the coastal areas of Gujarat and of the Coromandel coast in the south remained framed within the network of the maritime trade of the Indian Ocean. And the conditions there differed from the increasing isolation and impoverishment of large swaths of continental northern India. In the 4th and 5th centuries, in northern India, the dynasty of the imperial Guptas held sway over a large empire, while the Vatakas had ruled in western India. Under both dynasties, India had, as said, attained a peak of cultural and artistic achievements, accompanied by a high living standard and a high standard of welfare, the kind of joie de vivre that is captured in the one Indian classic any listener will be familiar with, namely the Kama Sutra. That is, if he or she reads the full text and not just the sexual portions and the sexual positions. In the 6th century, however, the Gupta dynasty vanished, and the succeeding centuries were a time of political confusion. The 7th century empire of Harsha had embraced most of northern India, but it did not outlast its founder. Until the 10th century, 3 major dynasties, the just mentioned Palas of Bengal, the Pratiharas to the north and west, and the Rashtrakutas of the western Deccan, were engaged in a constant but indecisive contest for the sovereignty of the imperial heartland of Harsha round the city of Kannauj. During this period of confusion, landholding became the chief basis of social and political status. There was an increasing fragmentation of local power under what scholars term the Samanta system. In the ancient empires in India, provincial administrators had been appointed, but the late antique realms were controlled by princes who had once been separate kings but were then reinstated. They had to pay tribute and serve the sovereign king. In the late Gupta period, this type of administration was occasionally found in borderlands. But by Harsha's time, and later on, these Samantas became powerful even in the core area of the empire. They enjoyed a great deal of autonomy within their own territory, and they soon surpassed any provincial governor in wealth and prestige. The Arab merchant Suleiman of Shiraz described the system as it had come to operate in the 9th century. Quote, "The Indians sometimes go to war for conquest, but the occasions for that are rare. I have never seen the people of one country submit to the authority of another, except in the case of that country which comes next to the country of pepper. If a king subdues a neighboring state, he places over it a man belonging to the family of the fallen prince, who carries on the government in the name of the conqueror. The inhabitants would not suffer it to be otherwise." End quote. All this meant, on the one hand, that ever more power devolved to such local chiefs, and that the king had to share his power with such local chiefs. And on the other it meant that despite the incessant conflict between kings, a conflict was never fought to destroy an opponent. It was rather fought for small gains in land and prestige, and required tribute both for the king and for the temples patronized by him, with tributary kings adopting the reach of the conqueror's kingdom. War in late antique India was thus a chivalric game that should never lead to the annihilation of the opponent. It should only make him recognize he had been outwitted, and he then had to give up the war to honor the victorious king and his patron god. But otherwise not much changed in the circle of kings. The game of chess that was originally an Indian war game and that became popular in Persia in the 7th century and from there passed on to Europe is a simulation of this kind of war, culminating in checkmate. This was one reason why the Indians were completely taken aback by the savage out-and-out form of warfare that commonly ended in the beheading of the opponent that the Central Asian Turks practiced. Under the Samanta system, an increasing portion of the agricultural product was taken from the peasantry to maintain those Samantas, as well as the holders of grants to temples and Brahmins, whose tenures too survived any change of overlords, were seldomly revoked, and were immune from the laws of the kingdom. Whence, for example, temples commonly served as places of asylum, since servants of a king were not allowed access into the inner sanctum of temples. For not only did the kings all want to project themselves as protectors of cows and Brahmins, but gifts to temples and to rituals honoring the king were the main way to project royal power in provinces that were controlled by the Samantas. The temples, hence, over time accumulated untold riches, and they became the dominant economic institutions of late antique India, with many, if not most peasants, working to maintain the lavish establishments of the temples, and most of the precious metals that were still flowing into India via the maritime trade were hoarded by the temples, as we shall see in the next episode. By the 9th century, a trend away from such loose empires as the Rashtrakutas to the consolidation of smaller local kingdoms or chieftainships is discernible, and the proliferation of subordinate tenures and rights. With the fragmentation of power, the volume of internal as well as external trade diminished, and the highways deteriorated. The monetary economy contracted. Gold coins were rarely issued in circulation after the fall of the Guptas, and even silver and copper coins became scarce and of poor quality. Instead, the economy now ran largely on cowrie shells as the medium of circulation. All this notwithstanding the quantities of precious metals which still came into India and that were either hoarded or employed in the adornment of religious establishments, or that were used in palaces and on the persons of the dominant classes. For as Marco Polo observed on the Rome of Calicut in Kerala, quote, "You must know that in all this kingdom of Malabar there is never a tailor to cut a coat or to stitch it, seeing that everybody goes naked at all times of the year. For decency only they wear a scrap of cloth. And so it is with men and women, with rich and poor, with the king himself. It is a fact that the king goes as bare as the rest. Only around his loins he has a piece of fine cloth, and round his neck he has a necklace, entirely of precious stones, rubies, sapphires, emeralds, and the like, insomuch that this collar is of great value. What this king wears between gold and gems and pearls is worth more than a city's ransom. End quote. The trade guilds, which had been an important feature of ancient Indian society, were in decline, and in some cases they vanished from history. And in urban life, the trend towards decentralization of Indian society was reflected in the proliferation of subcaste groups and the increasing rigidity of the hold of Brahmanical Hinduism and Shaiva and Vaishnava orthodoxy. The prescriptions of legal literature that impure castes should dwell outside the city walls seem to have been strictly implemented. As were such prescriptions in Kerala, the most orthodox part of India, as late as the 18th century. It is during this period too that prejudices against travel out of India, both overseas and across the Beas River in the Punjab, that marked the traditional boundary of the land of the Aryans, in which the higher castes were not to venture lest losing their caste, were incorporated into the legal literature as well. Nevertheless, the recession of trade was not absolute. While Biruni described Harsha's metropolis Kannauj as mostly deserted, urban life was maintained unbroken in such towns as Ujjain. The petty princely courts displayed great splendor, as did religious establishments. Considerable labor was employed in the construction of the great temples of medieval India, such as the famous ones of Khajuraho that date from this period. And we find in some cases and in some areas the construction of vast new tanks for irrigation. Certain foreign commodities, such as Chinese silk, circulated in remote areas of northern India, as did the better varieties of cotton cloths that were brought from very distant areas to regional markets. Foodstuffs, particularly grains, were transported over great distances too. Wheeled carts remained in use throughout the medieval period in India, which was not the case in many areas of the Mediterranean world. And descriptions exist of large caravans setting out for journeys taking many months. The prejudice against participation in overseas trade operated unequally too. Under the Pallavas and early Chola dynasty of southern India, and under the Pala dynasty in Bengal, overseas trade had been responsible for a great expansion of Hindu cultural influence in Southeast Asia. And as we know from inscriptions, Brahmins certainly settled there, all the scriptural prohibitions notwithstanding. The decline of the share of Hindu merchants and maritime trade there has been dated to a much later date, around the 12th century. Some Indian historians too see a turn of the tide around the year 1000. Hordes of gold coinage from such dynasties as the Chedis of eastern Madhya Pradesh and the Kahadawalas of Kannauj survive. Billion and copper coinages of the northwest of India became more plentiful, though they are still of rather poor quality. Whilst the Indians were thus withdrawing into voluntary isolation and became increasingly disinterested in the outside world, the western parts of Eurasia were swept by a massive upheaval. In the summer of the year 622, a man claiming to be a prophet, without any honor in his own country, fled with his 72 followers from his native town of Mecca to seek asylum in the town of Yathrib, since known as Madinat, the prophet city, which was located rather more than 200 miles north of Mecca. Little more than a century later, the successors and followers of this fugitive were ruling an empire which extended from the Atlantic to the Indus and from the Caspian to the cataracts of the Nile. An empire that included Spain and Portugal, some of the most fertile regions of southern France, the whole northern coast of Africa, upper and lower Egypt, their native Arabia, Syria, Mesopotamia, Armenia, Persia, Afghanistan, Baluchistan and Transoxania, or the modern former Central Asian republics of the Soviet Union. The Muslims threatened Christendom almost simultaneously from the east and from the west. They besieged Constantinople 3 times and advanced into the heart of France. And had it not been for the decisive victory of Emperor Theodosius III before Constantinople in 716 and the defeat inflicted on the Arabs near Tours in 732 by Charles the Hammer, the whole of Europe would have passed under their rule. As mentioned, practically at the same time they also defeated a Chinese army and penetrated into Xinjiang, to be however withheld by the rising might of the Tang dynasty. The Muslim faith is a universal religion, unlike Hinduism. And that word Hindu indeed is an Arab word, as the Hindus themselves have no word to describe their religion. A religion that lacks any central authority, any central profession of the faith, and that rather consists of several diverse professions of faith which share some sacred writings and some beliefs, but which are in reality further apart from one another as Christianity is from Islam. In contrast, in Islam, every man and every woman, without distinction of race or language, is called upon to witness the oneness of God and the mission of Muhammad by the Shahada sincerely pronounced. Consequently, every man is wont to adopt Sha'ir al-Islam, the marks of Islam. Those personal obligations that are implied in the 4 pillars of the faith: prayer, statutory almsgiving, the Ramadan feast, and the pilgrimage to Mecca. Besides of all those rules concerning food, circumcision, family life, wills, cemeteries or female modesty, which heads the life of any believer from the cradle to the grave. The statement of faith is by itself simple, however, and it consists of the 4 Quranic affirmations. The believers believe in God, in His angels, in His book, and in His messengers. All this is further explained and elaborated in Hadith on the future life, the resurrection, and the divine decrees. Far more strictly than Christianity, with its Trinity and saints, Islam is a strict monotheism, with an absolutely historical founder and with one sacred book, although its theology in regard to both differs from the Christian, as the Quran is held to be the literal word of God. There is also a perceptible difference in the criteria for membership of the community of the faith. Whereas in Christianity, acceptance of the Catholic creeds has been the main criterion, in Islam, the theology of the creed is not so important. Adherence to the holy law is the characteristic manifestation of the faith. Another difference is that Islam has no equivalent to the Christian sacraments, although certain practices, notably the feast of Ramadan and the pilgrimage, have an unacknowledged quasi-sacramental character. And Islam has no priesthood too, although the ulama, that is the religious scholars, and the elders of the Sufi orders, 2 groups that were in the early period of Islam closely interconnected, as we shall see later, have often played a part in Muslim societies that is comparable to that of the clergy amongst Christians. The absence of a sacerdotal hierarchy or of any systems of councils to define the faith, together with the primacy ascribed to obeying the law, has made Islam more tolerant of variations of belief than Christianity. It is generally true to say that heresy, to use a term not quite appropriate to Islam, has been repressed only when it was manifested as political subversion. It is also true to say that, since Islam is both a religious and a political community, the distinction between religious and political dissent is not very clear-cut. The Quran's preaching does not just deal with the dogmas of the faith, but it regulates every aspect of life. Great Muslim thinkers such as Al-Ghazali in the 11th century and Ibn Taymiyyah in the 14th century were to distinguish, on the one hand, the teaching of the religious truths and the regulations concerning worship. Those two could not be altered. On the other hand, there were moral teachings and regulations concerning human actions. The application of those regulations may vary according to times and circumstances. And finally, there was everything connected with social relations. Those matters depended on time and places. The Sunni ulama accepted and preached the theology formulated by Al-Ash'ari in the 10th century. In it, Allah's uniqueness and his absolute transcendence over his creation was emphasized. So too was his majesty and power. Allah is the Lord of the universe. He raises up heavens without visible supports. Not a leaf falls, but he knows it. If all the trees of the earth are pens, and all the 7 seas are ink, the praise of Allah cannot be exhausted. His is the command, and unto him all shall be brought back. He sends men astray, and he places them on the straight path again. His is the final judgment. Allah is hard towards his enemies, but he is essentially just and righteous. He is omnipotent and inscrutable, but he is merciful. Praise be to Allah, the Lord of the world, the beneficent, the merciful. There were 3 main directions in Islam. The Sunnis, the major faith in most Islamic countries, including the Indian subcontinent, believe that Muhammad, as the messenger of Allah, was the last of the prophets. They believed in angels, the day of judgment, in paradise and in hell. They professed equal respect for all the 4 caliphs, but with a sneaking empathy for Ali and for his martyr son Hassan and his martyr son Hussein. The supreme aim of life for the Sunnis was to earn sufficient religious merit to enter paradise. The purpose of man's life is to worship God, and everything else is secondary. The path to paradise was paved by right conduct and by worship coupled with right belief. There were 4 practices which ensured piety: 5 daily prayers, daily fast during the month of Ramadan, pilgrimage to Mecca, and charity to brother Muslims. All these observances together were rather external, devoid of religious emotion. Just as Sunni theology tended to be more formal, Sunni piety tended to be ritualistic. Both were nonetheless highly valued by the Orthodox. Furthermore, the collection of zakat, that is a religious tax to be distributed amongst poor Muslims, was supposed to be the duty of the state. Only a few, of course, could afford to go to Mecca for pilgrimage. The one who did, and thereby became a Haji, was treated with a respect that bordered on veneration. What was left open to the majority were the daily prayers and the fast of Ramadan. The Shia, now the majority faith in Iran, and that of a large minority in modern Yemen, Lebanon, Iraq, and also very common in Awadh, or the central part of Uttar Pradesh, focused on the city of Lucknow, recognized the authority of the Quran as the revealed word of Allah, and they subscribed to the finality of Muhammad's prophethood. But they rejected the first 3 caliphs, and they regarded Ali as the true successor of the Prophet, and therefore as the first Imam. The 12th Imam, Muhammad al-Mahdi, disappeared from the world, and he was expected to reappear to restore righteousness and justice. The authority of the Imam tended to overshadow the other beliefs of the Shia. The martyrdom of Hussein in the Shia belief had paved the way to paradise for all Shias. Based on this belief was the great importance that was attached to the Tawziyah, or the annual commemoration of Hussein's death. The Shias condemned the first three caliphs as the logical corollary to their belief in the exclusive legitimacy of Ali as the successor of the Prophet. Because of their considered view that they should conceal their true identity, it was not easy to distinguish Shias from Sunnis. The Ismailis, who are very numerous in Oman, believed in Allah as the only God, in Muhammad as his prophet, and in the Quran as his revelation. But they did not believe that prophethood had ended with Muhammad. They believed divine light had passed on to the Imams through Muhammad, the first Imam being the Caliph Ali. According to them, the seventh Imam, Muhammad ibn Ismail, had disappeared, and he was to reappear on the last day of creation. His vice-regents were nonetheless important. They alone could interpret the Quran because of its esoteric meaning. In the eyes of some believers, they were the incarnation of God themselves. The laws of the Sharia were not meant for them. By the beginning of the 8th century, the Arabs had brought the banners of the Prophet into Khedrosiyah, the modern Baluchistan, that torrid region that extends inland from the northern shore of the Sea of Oman. Immediately to the east of that province was the kingdom of Sindh. It was ruled by Dahir, a son of the usurping Brahman Charge dynasty, who had ousted the Shaka rulers from the country. An act of piracy by a nominal subject of Dahir led to a conflict with the Caliphate. According to one account, the king of Ceylon was sending to Al-Hajjaj, the viceroy of the eastern provinces of the Caliphate, the orphan daughters of Muslim merchants who had died in his dominion. But his vessel was attacked and plundered by pirates off the coast of Sindh. According to a very unlikely other account, the king of Ceylon had accepted Islam, and he was sending tribute to the commander of the faithful in Damascus when it was plundered. A final and the most plausible account is that Abdul Malik, the fifth Umayyad Caliph and father of Walid, the reigning caliph, had sent agents to India to purchase female slaves and various commodities, and that these agents, on reaching Debul, Dahir's principal seaport, had been attacked and plundered by brigands. Whatever the truth may be, Hajjaj then sent a letter through Muhammad bin Harun, governor of Baluchistan, in which he demanded reparations. But Dahir replied that those marauders were beyond his control and that he was powerless to punish them. To take his revenge, Halal sent out an expedition, at the head of which he placed his cousin and son-in-law Imam ud-Din Muhammad bin Qasim, a youth of 17. Muhammad, with his 6,000 Syrian horses, the flower of the armies of the caliphs, a camel corps of equal strength, and a baggage train of 3,000 camels, marched by way of Shiraz and then through the Makran desert directly towards Sindh. And by that march he probably completely surprised King Dahir, who had not likely expected an invasion to emerge out of that hostile wasteland. As some listeners may recall, marching through it had decimated Alexander the Great's armies 1,000 years before. On his way through Makran, Muhammad ibn Qasim had been joined by more troops, and the Arabs appeared now before Taibu, then a seaport, now inland. It was situated about 24 miles to the southwest of the modern town of Tatar. The date was autumn 711. Qasim's artillery, which included a great ballista for throwing stones and naphtha that was known as the Bride and that had to be worked by no less than 500 men, had been sent by sea to meet him at Taibu. That town was protected by strong stone fortifications, and it contained the great Hindu temple from which it took its name. The siege had continued for a while when a Brahmin, who had deserted from the temple, informed Muhammad bin Qasim that the garrison consisted of 4,000 men of the warrior Rajput caste, and that 3,000 shaven Brahmins served the temple. It was impossible, he said, to take the place by storm, for the Brahmins had prepared a talisman, and they had placed it at the base of the staff of the great red flag that flew from the steeple of the temple. It magically protected the defenders, and as long as it was there, the town was invincible. Now, nobody in the 8th century would have trifled with magic. So Muhammad ordered Ibn Jawiyah, who was in charge of the siege train, to shorten the foot of the bride. This would lower the trajectory of the stones and would make the flagstaff of the temple their mark. The third stone struck the flagstaff, shattered its base, and broke the talisman. Encouraged by this, the Arabs planted their ladders to the walls and they swarmed over them. The Brahmins and the other inhabitants of Taibu were summoned to accept Islam. When they refused, their wives and children were enslaved, and all males of the age of 17 and upward were put to the sword. The carnage lasted for 3 days, and Muhammad laid out a new Muslim quarter, built a mosque, and placed a garrison of 4,000 men in the town. The legally required fifth of the spoil of the town and 75 of the prettiest girls captured were sent to Al-Hajjaj, and the rest of the plunder was divided among the soldiers. Thus began Islamic rule on the Indian subcontinent. Muhammad ibn Qasim, with his heavy siege engine, Muhammad bin Qasim, with his heavy siege engines to support his picked troops, next took one fortified town after another. By the year 712, he had penetrated into the heartland of Sindh. He met King Dahir in a pitched battle on the banks of the river Indus near his capital Aror. It was fought with valor on both sides. But an Arab succeeded in landing an arrow to which burning cotton was attached into the howdah of Dahir's elephant, and the terrified beast then turned and fled towards the river, hotly pursued by the Arabs. Its driver, however, arrested its flight in midstream and induced the elephant once more to face the enemy. The battle was then renewed on the opposite bank of the river. Dahir charged the Arabs and wreaked havoc amongst them until he was struck by an arrow himself and then fell from his elephant. He managed to mount the horse, but an Arab cut him down, and the Hindu then fled from the field towards Aror, the capital. Meanwhile, Dahir's wife, Rani Bai, and her handmaids threw themselves into a fire at the palace to avoid falling into the hands of the mlechas, as Hindus call impure non-Hindu strangers. The Arabs were now in possession of Sindh and the lower Punjab, and their conquest marks a new stage in Muslim policy. The Quran lays down that Christians, Zoroastrians, and Jews, on account of their inspired scriptures, belong to a more favored class than the other unbelievers. They are people of the Holy Book, or Zimmi. Consequently, when conquered, their lives should be spared and their religion tolerated, as long as they subject themselves and as long as they pay a poll tax, the jizya. While the earliest interpretations of the Quran allowed other unbelievers only the choice between Islam and death. But the conquest of Sindh was not a holy war, for which formal authorization of the Caliph and of the ulama is required. It had been a mere private deed of revenge. And Muhammad al-Qasim wanted to arouse as little general hostility as possible. This led him to apply to the Caliph of the Faithful in Damascus for an amnesty to the Hindus. An amnesty that would spare their temples and allow them Zimmi status. He obtained that authorization too. And that was critical for the future expansion of Islam in India. But for the time being, with the conquest of Sindh, the early spread of Islam on the Indian subcontinent grinned to a halt. From Sindh, the Arabs made attempts to further inroads into India, but these were always held in check by various Indian potentates. Thus an inscription at Navshari in Gujarat of the Chalukya ruler from 739 records that he had defeated the Tajika, as the Indians called the Arabs, army that had hit Gujarat and that had advanced on Navshari, which was his capital. The Arabs also briefly occupied Sindh in Kutch, that is the western peninsula of Gujarat. But the success of all these raids was very limited, and the conquests were eventually evacuated. Besides that the Indian states were militarily too strong for the local forces the caliphs had available, the controls of the caliphs over their Indian dependency weakened too. In 871, it practically disappeared when Yaqub ibn Laid established his own dynasty, to whom the powerless caliph had to allot the sovereignty over Sindh. Aside from that over Balkh and Tabaristan in northeastern Iran, that he possessed already. However, Light dynasty, based on distant Balkh in western Afghanistan, exercised little actual control over such a remote region as Sindh that, as said, was separated by an impenetrable desert from western Iran. Power instead fell to several petty princes who, though they yielded no revenue and rendered no political allegiance to the Caliph, continued to recognize his nominal supremacy. They merely occasionally flattered him with some gifts. After their initial attempts, the Arabs also made no further serious attempts to break the power of the Rajput kings to the north and east, and their conquest of Sindh and of the lower Punjab left the rest of India completely untouched. The Indian powers were too strong for them, and the Arabs limited themselves to commercial deals. The bull became the major entrepot in the commerce between the Middle East and India in that period. And maybe indeed that was what the Arabs had also intended with the conquest of Sindh, as they had always a keen eye for commercial gain. Locally, their authority was supported by Arab soldier colonists who settled down in Sindh and took local brides, while the administration of the countryside was largely left in the hands of the people of the country, and the taxation of the Hindu cultivators of the land was eminently fair. Otherwise, the Arabs rather preferred to profit from Hinduism than that they actively combated it. The furthest frontier of Arab settlements that became a bastion of the Ismaili branch of Islam, much persecuted in the central Arab lands, whence many probably went to the most distant frontier of Islam in India, was described by the geographer Al-Masudi around 930 as follows, quote, Multan is one of the strongest frontier places of the Muslims, and around it there are 120,000 towns and villages. In it is the idol also known by the name of Mitin. The inhabitants of Sindh and India perform pilgrimages to it from the most distant places. They carry money, precious stones, aloe wood, and all sorts of perfumes there to fulfill their vows. The greatest part of the revenue of the king of Multan is derived from the rich presents brought to the idol of the pure aloe wood of Kumar, which is of the finest quality. When the unbelievers march against Multan and the faithful do not feel themselves strong enough to oppose them, they threaten to break the idol, and their enemies immediately withdraw. An invasion of a very different character was to descend on India with the invasion of Mahmud of Ghazni and his Turkish armies, that we shall treat in the next episode.